2 weeks ago, we started looking at 1 John chapter 3. And 1 John chapter 3 is it's a very interesting chapter. If you have kind of been around church very long and you've read it, you probably know there's a lot of different interpretations of it. There are, even in the different English translations, there are many different translations of it. And last week, or 2 weeks ago, we did a big preamble to talk about translation a little bit and how it works, and that, just little things like there's no such thing as a word-for-word translation. And a lot of people say, like, oh, my Bible's word for word. That doesn't exist, because you can't, if you try to take Greek and translate it word for word into English, it would make no sense. Just like if you try to do that with Spanish, or if you try to do that, all sorts of languages. So when they're translating, oftentimes the translators are looking at what's the heart of the passage, or the interpretation of the passage, to help to choose the Greek or the English words to use to assign to the Greek. And so we're not trying to cast any dispersion or doubt on the validity of the scriptures. If you were to go, each Bible that's translated, or each Bible version that's translated, is translated Old and New Testament from about 5,500 individual manuscripts that are Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, right? And then those are looked at together. So if you look at 1 John from the Greek copies that we have, because remember, it's important, like, unless the Vatican has it locked up, nobody has, like, the letter from Paul. Does that make sense? That these were all copied, and it's not, oftentimes it gets the Bible gets, I don't know, people say things like, oh, it's been translated so many times, or they say it's like a game of telephone, except that it's not even remotely. In fact, when translation is done, it's done very meticulous. When the copies were done, if we were to go into how the Jews did copying, and Jews, remember 3,000 Jews get saved to become Christians, or right around that number, because they're all there in Jerusalem for a feast, the people that the kind of church starts with. So all that to say is that copying and recording and these things was not a game of telephone, and it's incredibly reliable. But in that reliability, in our English translations, they vary. And they vary because people, translators that love Jesus and love you guys, and they're trying to get it right according to the meaning. So in 1 John, some of the meanings are disputed. In other words, there's people that say one thing, there's people that say another thing. And we talked in some detail about that 2 weeks ago when I was here. But as we kind of jump back into it today, just by review, remember, we're big context people, right? It always matters, who is he writing to? Why is he writing? Right? Those are all important things. So he says in chapter 1, right off the bat, he says, we're writing to you. In verse 4, he says, to make our joy complete. In verse 3, he says he's writing because what they saw, what they heard, what they looked upon, and the idea is what they, remember we've been talking probably more than usual about Greek tenses and so forth, that he's not just saying we glanced at Jesus, he's saying we considered him and came to a conclusion. It's in a perfect tense. So when he says we looked upon him, he's not just saying like we saw Jesus this one time and we're pretty sure. No, he's saying we were with him, we touched him, we heard him, we saw him, so we came to a conclusion that he's the Lord, that he's the Christ, right? And he says we want to pass that on to you so that you can have fellowship with us, because our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And this is super important because, remember, he's going to lay out all these kind of very stark litmus tests, these tests. But they're not tests of they're not tests of life, tests of salvation, they're tests of fellowship. He says, we're writing to you so that you can have fellowship with God, not just so that you can be saved. We know he's already writing to save people, because he uses this over and over again, little children, dear children. For the NIV translates the word teknia as dear children. The cool thing about, I think, if you want to geek out for a second, the cool thing about teknia is John is the only guy that uses that word in the whole Bible. And it's not even super common in like regular Greek of the day. It's literally like calling someone, the thing I liken it to, years ago and many pounds ago, I spent a summer down in Mexico digging ditches for Jesus. And no, it was good. Actually, it was some of the best memories of my life. But they had the family that I stayed with, they had this little chunky kid, and they called him Gordito, which we have now at Taco Bell. But it's literally just means like little chunky one or little fat one, which for us might be offensive, but it was a term of endearment. Does that make sense? And so basically technia is a term that John uses from the word teknon. So teknon, which is also translated little children, teknon is little born ones. Little born ones. And teknia, dear children, is like this, it's like a fatherly affection, right? In another place, he'll say, I have no greater joy except to know that my children are walking with the Lord, right? So John's expressing his heart here. So who is he writing to? He's writing to believers, and he's writing to believers because he wants to invite people that are already saved to walk with God and have fellowship with him. Remember another word that's going to come up again, this word meno in Greek, and it is usually translated abide. And John uses it 27 times in his gospel in 3 letters. And he's really one of the only people that use it in the New Testament at all. So John's whole emphasis of his ministry, his whole emphasis of his letters is writing to believers so they can have full joy. Right? Well, joy is it's not just happiness, it includes happiness, but it's the idea of a happiness or a cheerfulness that results from essentially something outside of my circumstances. So I can have joy in Christ when my life on the earth is terrible, because I have expectation and I have trust in these things that I know God's working something out for me, right? So he's saying, I'm writing to you guys, in this case, specific people, and now to us by proxy. I'm writing to you guys because I want you to have joy. You're going to have that joy if you stick close or if you abide with Jesus, okay? That is his whole context. So when he starts saying things like, hey, in John, in chapter 1, verse 8, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Why does he say that? Is he saying you're not saved if you sin? No, he's saying, look, if you as a believer try to say in your life that I don't sin, I don't have that, he says, then you're wrong. You're lying. You can't be in fellowship with God because you're not in agreement with God. Remember, he's going to talk about in verse 9, confessing sin. It's that word, that Greek word homologeo, to say the same thing. So he's saying you can't say that you have this close relationship with God if you're not agreeing with him about what he says about you and about life in general. Does that make sense? So these stark differences that he's making, that he's talking about, along with the fact that he's also going to talk about false teachers, they all come into play when we get to chapter 3. We know he's referencing some false teachers because he says there in verse 26 of chapter 2, I am writing these things to you about those who are trying to lead you astray. So part of his letter is clearly, and it would appear to be, Gnostic heretics, and we talked about that also in great detail a few weeks ago. He is addressing Gnostic heretics, heretics that are attacking who Jesus is and what he did, what he accomplished at the cross. So that comes into play with chapter 3 also, because he's going to say the same thing about those who are trying to deceive you, okay? This all matters when we start breaking down what he's saying in chapter 3.